Before we dive into this story, subscribe to the channel and click the like button. It's a small gesture with a big impact. And tell me, where are you listening from? The morning of Catherine Pemberton's wedding began with rain. Heavy clouds pressed against the windows of her family's London townhouse, darkening the silk wallpaper and muting the fires that burned in every grate. Her mother had declared it a blessing. Rain on a wedding day meant prosperity, fertility, fortune. But as Catherine stood before the mirror in her ivory gown, watching her maid adjust the lace at her throat, she felt only the weight of water against glass, and the certainty that this day marked not a beginning, but an ending of something she could not name. She had met the Duke of Thornhill only 3 times before this morning. The first, at a garden party, where he had bowed with perfect correctness and spoken fewer than 20 words. The second, in her father's study, where the marriage contract was discussed in her presence, but not with her participation. The third, at a formal dinner, where he sat beside her and carved pheasant with elegant precision while maintaining a conversation that revealed nothing of his thoughts, his preferences, or his heart. He was handsome in a cold, classical way. Dark hair, grey eyes, features that might have been carved from marble. He moved through society with the ease of someone who had never questioned his place within it, and he was, by every measure that mattered to her family, an excellent match. The ceremony took place at St. George's Church in Hanover Square. Catherine walked down the aisle on her father's arm, aware of the hundreds of faces turned toward her, the whispers of approval at her gown, her composure, her good fortune. Alexander stood at the altar in his morning coat, his expression unreadable. When she reached him, he took her hand with the impersonal courtesy one might extend to any stranger. His fingers were cool and dry. The vows were spoken in voices that carried through the vaulted space with clarity and no warmth. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Alexander lifted her veil and pressed his lips to hers for exactly the duration propriety required. His mouth was firm and utterly detached. The breakfast that followed was a performance of perfection. 300 guests filled the ballroom of the Duke's London residence, a magnificent house in Grosvenor Square, with gilded ceilings and chandeliers that cast prisms of light across damask walls. Catherine sat beside her new husband at the head table, smiling at congratulations, accepting toasts, cutting cake with his hand placed formally over hers. They danced the first waltz together, moving through the steps with synchronized grace, and not a single word exchanged between them. She could feel the eyes of society upon them, assessing, approving. They looked, she knew, like the ideal union of rank and beauty. No one could see that beneath the silk and diamonds and fixed smiles, she was dancing with a man who looked through her as if she were glass. That night, Catherine was led to the ducal suite by Alexander's housekeeper, Mrs. Hensworth, a dignified woman with kind eyes and a voice that suggested she had witnessed many such nights and understood their particular loneliness. The chambers were luxurious, pale green silk on the walls, a 4-poster bed with embroidered hangings, windows that overlooked the square's private gardens. Catherine's trunks had been unpacked, her belongings arranged in wardrobes and on dressing tables. It looked like a room where someone might be happy. Mrs. Hensworth helped her undress, brushed out her hair, draped a nightgown of fine lawn over her shoulders. Then she withdrew, closing the door softly, and Catherine was left alone with the sound of her own breathing and the tick of the mantel clock counting down the minutes until Alexander would come. He arrived precisely at midnight. He knocked, a courtesy that surprised her, and entered when she answered. He wore a dressing gown of dark blue silk and carried himself with the same controlled formality he had maintained throughout the day. He did not meet her eyes. What followed was brief, awkward, and executed with a sense of duty that made Catherine feel less like a bride than a task to be completed. He was not rough, but neither was he tender. He spoke only once to ask if he had hurt her. When she whispered no, he nodded and continued until the act was finished. Afterward, He rose, straightened his dressing gown and bid her good night with the same tone he might use to dismiss a servant. Then he left, and Catherine heard his footsteps recede down the corridor toward his own chambers in the west wing of the house. She lay awake for hours, staring at the canopy above her bed, trying to understand what had just occurred. This was marriage. This was the future she had been prepared for since childhood, the destiny every girl of her rank was taught to accept with grace. And yet the loneliness she felt in that moment was more profound than anything she had known in her 20 years. She had entered this union with modest hopes, not for grand passion, but for companionship, respect, perhaps even affection over time. She had imagined conversations over breakfast, shared walks in the garden. The slow building of partnership that her parents' marriage had shown her was possible. But Alexander had made it clear, without ever saying the words directly, that he expected none of those things. He had married her for the same reason one acquired property, because it was prudent, expected, and necessary to secure an heir. When dawn came, Catherine rose and dressed herself, unwilling to summon her maid and face the quiet sympathy she knew would be in the woman's eyes. She descended to the breakfast room and found Alexander already there, reading the Times behind a wall of newsprint. He acknowledged her arrival with a slight nod, but did not lower the paper. A footman served her tea and toast. She ate in silence, the clink of her spoon against porcelain the only sound besides the rustle of pages. When Alexander finally stood to leave for his morning appointments, he paused at the door and informed her, in the tone of someone conveying information of minor importance, that they would be departing for Thornhill Manor in 3 days' time. Then he was gone, and Catherine was left alone, with her tea growing cold, and the realization settling over her like frost. This was not the beginning of her life. It was the end of her girlhood dreams. 7 years passed in a rhythm that became, by necessity, bearable. Thornhill Manor became Catherine's world, a vast estate in the Cotswolds, surrounded by rolling hills and ancient oaks, beautiful in its isolation and suffocating in its silence. The house itself was a masterpiece of Georgian architecture, all clean lines and perfect proportions, filled with art and heirlooms that spoke of generations of wealth and taste. Catherine learned its rooms and corridors, its gardens and follies, until she could walk them blindfolded. She learned also the patterns of her husband's life and arranged her own around them, like furniture, positioned to avoid collision. Alexander occupied the west wing. His study, his library, his chambers, all existed in a domain she entered only when specifically summoned, which occurred perhaps once a month. These summons followed a predictable schedule, timed, she came to understand, to maximize the possibility of conception. He would send word through Mrs. Hensworth in the morning. Catherine would prepare herself, bathing in rosewater, braiding her hair, wearing the nightgowns that fastened easily. He would arrive, perform the act with the same efficient detachment as always, and depart. In the beginning, she had tried to speak to him during these encounters, to ask about his day, his thoughts, to forge some connection, however small. But her questions were met with brief, dismissive answers that made clear he found conversation during intimacy distasteful. So she learned silence. She learned to turn her face away and count the minutes until it ended, and she could be alone again with her shame and her sorrow. No child came. Month after month, year after year, her courses arrived with the regularity of the seasons, and each time Catherine felt a confusing mixture of relief and failure. Relief because she could not imagine bringing a child into this cold arrangement, and failure because she knew an heir was the sole purpose of her existence in Alexander's eyes. He never spoke of it, never asked, but she could see the assessment in his gaze on the rare occasions when they encountered each other in the corridors or at dinner, a calculation of her usefulness, her adequacy, her worth as an investment that had not yet yielded returns. They maintained appearances scrupulously. When society demanded it, Christmas, the summer season, important political gatherings, they travelled to London and played the role of the devoted ducal couple. They attended balls and dinners and the opera. They hosted garden parties at Thornhill Manor, where 200 guests wandered the grounds and remarked on the beauty of the estate and the grace of the Duchess. Catherine learned to smile with precisely the right amount of warmth, to deflect personal questions with charming vagueness, to ensure that no one ever suspected the truth of her marriage. Alexander, for his part, was always beside her at these events, attentive in gesture if not in feeling, his hand at her elbow, his voice murmuring polite acknowledgments of compliments directed at his wife. To the outside world, they were the picture of aristocratic harmony, but inside Thornhill Manor, they were strangers. They took breakfast in separate rooms. They spent their days in separate pursuits. Dinner was served in the formal dining room at 8 o'clock each evening, a meal taken at opposite ends of a table that seated 24, with Catherine at one end and Alexander at the other, and between them a polished expanse of mahogany across which they exchanged perhaps a dozen words about estate business or necessary social obligations. Then Alexander would retire to his study for port and correspondence, and Catherine would retreat to the east wing, to her own sitting room, where a fire always burned and books waited, and she could finally exhale. She built a life in the spaces Alexander did not occupy. She learned the names and histories of every servant in the house and treated them with a kindness that earned their fierce loyalty. She took over the management of the household accounts and discovered she had a talent for it, finding efficiencies, ensuring the staff were fairly compensated, overseeing repairs and improvements that made Thornhill Manor run more smoothly than it had in decades. She walked the estate every morning, learning the names of tenant families, visiting when there was illness or hardship, establishing a charity school for the village children that she funded from her own allowance. She painted. In her first year at Thornhill Manor, wandering the empty rooms during a sleepless night, she had discovered the conservatory, a glass-walled structure on the east side of the house that had been allowed to fall into disrepair. Broken panes, overgrown plants, furniture covered in dust. She claimed it as her own, hired workmen to restore it, and transformed it into a studio. She ordered canvases, paints, brushes. She had no formal training, but she had always loved to sketch, and in that light-filled space she taught herself to paint. At first her work was tentative, clumsy, but over the years her skill grew. She painted the gardens in every season, the hills beyond the estate, the village church with its Norman tower. And she painted portraits, not of people, but of emotions, abstract compositions of color and form that expressed things she had no other way to say. Loneliness in shades of blue and grey, resignation in muted browns, the faint, stubborn persistence of hope in threads of gold that wound through darker hues. The conservatory became her sanctuary. Alexander never entered it, never asked about her work. The paintings accumulated, stacked against walls, proof of her interior life, of the self she maintained in the absence of witness. Sometimes Mrs. Hensworth would come with tea and sit quietly while Catherine worked, offering companionship without intrusion. The housekeeper never asked questions, but Catherine sensed her understanding, her sorrow for the young Duchess who lived like a widow, in a house full of wealth and beauty and no love. Catherine learned not to hope. She learned to find satisfaction in small things, a well-tended garden, a child's progress in her school, the way light fell through the conservatory glass at dawn. She learned to be grateful for what she had, safety, comfort, autonomy within her limited sphere. She told herself that many women had far worse marriages, that coldness was preferable to cruelty, that loneliness was survivable. She convinced herself she had accepted her life, made peace with it, built something worthwhile within its constraints. But late at night, alone in her bed, she sometimes allowed herself to remember what she had once imagined marriage might be. She remembered the novels she had read as a girl, full of courtship and conversation, the slow discovery of another soul. She remembered watching her parents, her father reading aloud while her mother embroidered, their easy laughter, the way they gravitated toward each other in a room full of people. She had thought foolishly that such things were possible for her too. And though she tried to bury those memories, to accept that they belonged to a naive girl who no longer existed, they surfaced sometimes like ghosts, reminding her of all she had lost before she ever truly had it. Through it all, Alexander remained a mystery. She knew his routines, his preferences, the way he took his coffee and the hours he kept. But she did not know him. She did not know what he thought about when he stared out his study window at the hills. She did not know if he ever felt the loneliness that consumed her, or if his heart was simply constructed differently, capable of contentment in isolation. Once, only once, she had tried to bridge the distance between them. It was their 3rd anniversary, and she had commissioned a painting as a gift, a landscape of Thornhill Manor at sunset, rendered with all the skill she had developed. She had it wrapped and presented it to him at dinner, her heart beating fast with hope that this gesture might open a door, however slightly. He unwrapped it, studied it for a long moment and said, "It's very accomplished. You may hang it in the morning room if you like." Then he set it aside and returned to his meal. She never tried again. Mrs. Hensworth once told her, in a rare moment of candour, that the Duke had loved someone before his marriage. A young woman, the daughter of a neighbouring family, who had died of a fever just months before the wedding was arranged. Catherine had listened to this information with a strange mixture of relief and despair. Relief because it explained everything. The distance, the coldness, the sense that Alexander was always looking past her towards something she could never be. Despair because she understood then that she was not fighting her own inadequacy, but competing with a ghost. And ghosts, being perfect in memory, could never be defeated. She never spoke of this knowledge to Alexander. What would be the point? It would not change the fundamental architecture of their marriage, would not make him see her as anything other than the living reminder of what he had lost. So she carried the knowledge quietly, let it settle into the foundation of her understanding, and continued the daily performance of being the Duchess of Thornhill, gracious, capable, invisible. By the 7th year, Catherine had achieved something she supposed was a form of peace. Not happiness, but a sustainable equilibrium. She had her conservatory, her charitable work, her small dignities. She had learned not to flinch when Alexander looked through her, not to hope for more than the bare minimum of courtesy. She had built a self sufficient enough to survive without the love she would never receive. She thought she had accepted her fate. And then came the invitation to the midsummer ball at Westwood House, and everything she had carefully constructed began, imperceptibly at first, to crack. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in June. Catherine was in the conservatory, working on a painting of wild roses that climbed the garden wall, when Mrs. Hensworth brought it on a silver tray. The envelope was heavy cream stock, the handwriting elegant. The Earl and Countess of Somerset requested the pleasure of the Duke and Duchess of Thornhill's company at the Midsummer Ball, to be held on the 21st of June. Catherine set down her brush and read it twice, her stomach tightening with the familiar dread of social performance. She found Alexander in his study that afternoon and showed him the invitation. He glanced at it and nodded. "We'll attend. I'll send word to prepare the London house. We'll go up on the 19th. Must we?" The words escaped before she could stop them. She had grown to hate London, hate the pretense required to maintain their facade before society. Alexander looked up from his papers, one eyebrow raised. "The Earl is politically important. Our attendance is expected." "Of course," Catherine said quietly. "I only meant—" "I know what you meant," he interrupted, his tone not unkind, but final. "Nevertheless, we will go. Please ensure you have an appropriate gown." And that was the end of the discussion. Catherine withdrew, closing the study door softly behind her, and returned to her conservatory, where the roses on her canvas had begun to look like blood against the stone. The afternoon before they were to depart for London, Catherine received an unexpected visitor. Lady Margaret Ashford, her closest friend from childhood, now married to a baron and living in Bath, arrived in a flurry of travelling cloaks and excitement. She had heard the Beaumonts would be in London for the midsummer ball and had arranged her own visit to coincide. Catherine greeted her with genuine warmth, the first real smile she had felt in weeks. They took tea in Catherine's sitting room, and Margaret, who had always possessed an uncomfortable talent for seeing past surfaces, studied her friend with concerned eyes. "You've grown too thin," she said bluntly, "and too quiet." "Catherine, are you well?" "I'm perfectly well," Catherine assured her, pouring tea with steady hands. "Life at Thornhill Manor is peaceful." "Peaceful," Margaret repeated, making the word sound like an accusation. "My dear, you're only 27 years old. You shouldn't be peaceful. You should be gloriously alive." Catherine smiled sadly. "Some of us are not built for glory, Margaret." They talked of other things, Margaret's children, Bath society, mutual friends. But when the afternoon drew to a close and Margaret rose to return to her hotel, she took both of Catherine's hands in hers. "Promise me something," she said. "Promise me that at this ball you'll dance. Not just the obligatory dances with your husband or aged relatives. Dance with someone who makes you smile. For God's sake, Catherine, allow yourself one evening of joy." Catherine wanted to explain that joy was not something she could simply allow herself, that she had no idea how to reach for it anymore. But Margaret's eyes were so earnest, so full of affection, that she found herself nodding. "I promise I'll try." The journey to London took most of a day. Catherine and Alexander travelled in the ducal coach, sitting on opposite benches, watching the countryside give way to suburbs, and then to the crowded streets of the city. They had not exchanged more than 20 words since leaving Thornhill Manor. When they arrived at the Grosvenor Square house, they separated immediately. Alexander to his clubs and political business, Catherine to her chambers to rest before the ordeal of the ball. On the evening of the 21st, Catherine's lady's maid helped her dress with unusual care. The gown was new, ordered months ago for the season. Emerald silk that brought out the colour of her eyes, cut in the latest fashion with a modest neckline and delicate puffed sleeves. Her dark hair was arranged in an elaborate style with pearls woven through the curls. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw a beautiful woman, elegantly dressed, every inch the Duchess. She also saw the faint shadows beneath her eyes, the tightness around her mouth, the careful blankness she had learned to wear like armour. Alexander was waiting in the entrance hall when she descended the stairs. He was striking in his evening clothes, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples, his bearing radiating the casual authority of his rank. He watched her descend without expression, then offered his arm with mechanical courtesy. "You look well," he said. "Thank you," she replied, and they walked out to the waiting coach in silence. Westwood House blazed with light. Hundreds of candles illuminated the ballroom, reflecting off gilded mirrors and crystal chandeliers until the space seemed to shimmer with its own luminescence. The cream of London society had gathered, duchesses and earls, diplomats and military heroes, beautiful young women in their first season, and dowagers dripping with diamonds. Music swelled from the orchestra, champagne flowed from fountains, and the air was thick with perfume and ambition and the peculiar electricity of people performing at the highest stakes of social theatre. Catherine and Alexander made their entrance together, announced by the butler in a voice that carried across the ballroom. Heads turned, greetings were exchanged. They moved through the crowd like figures in a painting, perfect and hollow. Alexander was drawn almost immediately into a political discussion with several members of Parliament. Catherine stood beside him for the required interval, smiling politely, then excused herself with the skill of long practice and drifted toward the edge of the ballroom, where she could breathe. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing footman and positioned herself near a window where she could watch the dancing without being too obviously alone. This was her usual strategy at such events, to be present but not prominent, available but not eager. She had become expert at invisibility in crowds. The first dances passed. Alexander performed his duty, leading her onto the floor for one waltz executed with their usual synchronized indifference. Then he returned her to the sidelines and disappeared again into the knots of men discussing reform bills and trade agreements. Catherine sipped her champagne and watched other couples spin past. Young lovers, comfortable married pairs, skilled dancers who moved like they had been choreographed. She felt the familiar ache of exclusion, the sense of watching life happen to other people while she stood perpetually at the margins. Duchess Beaumont. The voice came from beside her, cultured and gently uncertain. I hope I'm not intruding. Catherine turned and found herself looking at a man she recognized but had never formally met. Viscount William Blackwood. She knew the name from social registers, knew he had lost his wife to consumption 2 years prior, knew he had a reputation for kindness and had largely withdrawn from society during his mourning. He was perhaps 35, with warm brown eyes and a face that suggested he smiled often, though there was sadness in the lines around his mouth. Not at all, Lord Blackwood, she said, surprised by his approach. I find these affairs rather overwhelming after so long away, he admitted with a slight smile. I'm attempting to regain my footing, but I confess I feel rather like a ghost at my own resurrection. The comment was so unexpectedly honest that Catherine laughed, a real laugh, spontaneous and unbidden. That's perhaps the most accurate description of a London ball I've ever heard. His smile widened. I'm glad someone understands. Lady Somerset insisted I attend, said it was time I rejoined the living. I'm beginning to think she meant it as punishment. They fell into conversation with an ease that startled Catherine. He asked about Thornhill Manor, and she found herself describing the estate with genuine enthusiasm, the gardens, her charitable school, the beauty of the Cotswolds. He listened with focused attention, asking questions that suggested real interest rather than mere politeness. He told her about his own small estate in Yorkshire, about his efforts to modernize his farming methods, about the novel he was reading. It was, Catherine realized with a shock, an actual conversation, the kind she had not experienced in 7 years. When the orchestra struck up another waltz, William hesitated, then said, "Would you do me the honor, Duchess? I'm told it's like riding a horse. One never truly forgets, but I make no promises about my skill after such a long absence." Catherine's first instinct was to refuse. She always refused such invitations, maintaining the unspoken understanding that she danced only with her husband or the most elderly and unthreatening partners. But Margaret's words echoed in her mind. Allow yourself one evening of joy, and something in William's open, hopeful expression made her want to be brave. I'd be delighted, she heard herself say. He led her onto the floor with a gentle hand at her elbow. When they assumed the waltz position, his touch was light, respectful, nothing like the impersonal grip Alexander maintained during their obligatory dances. The music began, and they moved into the pattern of the waltz. William had understated his skill. He was an accomplished dancer, leading her smoothly through the turns and sweeps of the music. But more remarkable than his technical ability was the quality of his presence. He was there with her, fully attentive, not performing for the watching crowd, but engaging in a shared experience. He smiled at her as they danced, not the practiced social smile she was accustomed to, but something genuine and warm. You're an excellent dancer, Duchess, he said. As are you, Lord Blackwood. You needn't have worried. Oh, but worry is what I do best, he replied lightly. It's my singular talent. My late wife used to say I could find cause for concern in a sunny day and a field of flowers. The mention of his wife might have created awkwardness, but the way he spoke of her, with love and grief, but also acceptance, made it feel natural. She sounds like she understood you well, Catherine said gently. She did. I was blessed beyond measure to have found her, and I miss her every day. But he paused, then continued with careful honesty. I'm learning that missing her doesn't mean I must stop living. It's taken me 2 years to understand that, and I'm still not certain I've got it right. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes at the raw truth in his words. "I think that's very wise," she managed. "What about you, Duchess? Are you content at Thornhill Manor?" The question was simple, the kind asked 1,000 times at events like this. But the way he asked it, as if her answer actually mattered, as if he genuinely wanted to know, undid something in Catherine's careful defenses. She found herself answering honestly. "I've made a life there that I value," she said slowly. "But content? I'm not certain I know what that means anymore." He looked at her with such understanding that she had to glance away. "Sometimes we build beautiful cages for ourselves," he said quietly, "and call them peace." They danced in silence for a moment, the music swelling around them. Catherine was aware of the other couples, the watching eyes of society, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel the weight of performance. She felt simply present, held in the gentle orbit of this man's respectful attention, allowed to be herself without judgment or expectation. When the waltz ended, William led her from the floor. "Thank you, Duchess. That was the first time I've enjoyed a dance since, well, in a very long time." "As have I," Catherine admitted, then surprised herself by adding, "Perhaps, if you find yourself in the area, you might call at Thornhill Manor. I would welcome the conversation." His face brightened. "I would be honored. In fact, I have business in the Cotswolds next month. Perhaps I might—" "Catherine." Alexander's voice cut through the moment like a blade. He appeared beside them, his expression controlled but his eyes cold. "We should pay our respects to the Earl before leaving." Catherine felt the warmth of the past half-hour drain away, replaced by the familiar chill of her husband's presence. "Of course. Lord Blackwood, thank you for the dance." "The pleasure was entirely mine, Duchess." William bowed, his gaze flickering briefly to Alexander with an assessment Catherine couldn't read. She allowed Alexander to guide her away, his hand on her elbow, with a pressure that was not quite painful, but was certainly not gentle. They made their farewells to their hosts, retrieved their cloaks, and departed into the night. In the coach, Alexander sat across from her, in rigid silence. Catherine stared out the window at the dark streets of London and tried to recapture the feeling of those few moments on the dance floor when she had felt, however briefly, like a person rather than a piece of furniture. "Who was that man?" Alexander finally asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Viscount Blackwood. He's recently come out of mourning for his wife. And you know him how?" "I don't know him. He introduced himself this evening. We danced. It was perfectly proper." "Proper." Alexander repeated the word, as if tasting something bitter. "You were laughing with him. I saw you from across the room. I've never seen you laugh like that." Catherine turned to look at her husband, startled by something in his tone she couldn't identify. "He said something amusing. People do laugh at amusing things, Your Grace." "Don't," he said sharply. "Don't call me that. You're my wife." "Am I?" The words came out before she could stop them, sharp with 7 years of suppressed anger. "I'm the Duchess of Thornhill, Your Grace. I perform that role to your specifications, but a wife, that would require you to be a husband, and you've made abundantly clear that's not a position you're interested in fulfilling." Silence fell between them, dense and dangerous. Catherine's heart pounded. She had never spoken to him like this, had never allowed her true feelings to surface in his presence. She expected him to respond with fury or cold dismissal. Instead, after a long moment, he said quietly, "We're returning to Thornhill Manor tomorrow." "Of course," Catherine replied, her voice shaking slightly. "As you wish." They spoke no more that night. But in the darkness of the coach, as London's lights gave way to suburbs and then to countryside, Catherine felt the first tremors of something shifting, not in Alexander perhaps, but in herself. The cage William had spoken of suddenly felt visible, and once seen, impossible to unsee. Alexander Beaumont had not expected the jealousy to feel like drowning. He sat in his study at Thornhill Manor 3 days after returning from London, staring at correspondence he couldn't read, unable to concentrate on anything beyond the image burned into his mind. Catherine on the ballroom floor, spinning in another man's arms, her face radiant with laughter, alive in a way he had never seen her in 7 years of marriage. It shouldn't matter. She was his wife, yes, but their arrangement had been clear from the beginning: duty, heirs, public respectability, and nothing more. He had given her everything a duchess could want: wealth, status, freedom to pursue her own interests within the bounds of propriety. He had made no demands of her beyond the necessary ones, had not burdened her with emotional expectations she couldn't fulfill. It was a reasonable arrangement, the kind many aristocratic couples maintained with perfect satisfaction, except when he had looked across that ballroom and seen her laughing up at Viscount Blackwood. Something had cracked inside his chest, sharp and painful as a breaking rib. She had never looked at him that way, not once. Not even on their wedding day, when she had still harbored naive hopes he could see in her eyes. He had watched those hopes die slowly over the years, watched her learn to school her features into pleasant blankness, watched her retreat into herself until she moved through Thornhill Manor like a ghost, present, efficient, invisible. He had told himself he preferred it that way. Grief had taught him that love was a luxury, a weakness, a risk he would never take again. His first love, Emma, had died 7 months before his wedding, and with her had died his capacity for tenderness, his belief in happiness, his ability to see any woman without measuring her against the ghost of perfection. Catherine had been merely the obligation that followed, the practical necessity his family insisted upon. He had tried to keep her at a distance, had succeeded so thoroughly that she had learned to maintain that distance herself. And now, after 7 years of careful indifference, he couldn't stop thinking about the way she had looked at another man. The jealousy was irrational, hypocritical, impossible to justify, but it consumed him anyway, churning in his gut like poison. Alexander rose from his desk and walked to the window. The east lawn stretched before him, and beyond it, visible through the trees, was the conservatory where Catherine spent her mornings. He had never gone there, had never asked to see her paintings, had treated her artistic pursuits with the same benign neglect he applied to everything about her that didn't directly concern him. Mrs. Hensworth's words from 2 years ago surfaced in his memory. The housekeeper had been giving him the quarterly household report when she'd added, almost casually, "The Duchess has done remarkable work with the village school, Your Grace. The children are thriving under her instruction." Alexander had nodded, made some vague comment about it being appropriate charitable work, and moved on to the next topic. Mrs. Hensworth had looked at him with something that might have been disappointment, but he'd ignored it. How many such moments had there been? How many times had his staff, his tenants, even casual acquaintances, tried to tell him that his wife was extraordinary, and he had simply not listened? He thought of the painting she'd given him on their 3rd anniversary, the sunset over Thornhill Manor, that he'd hung in the morning room without really looking at it. It was still there. He walked past it every day and had stopped seeing it years ago. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called. Mrs. Hensworth stepped in, her expression carefully neutral in the way that meant she had something to say, but wasn't certain she should say it. "Your Grace, Viscount Blackwood has called. He says he has business in the area and hoped he might pay his respects." Every muscle in Alexander's body tensed. "Tell him I'm engaged." He asked specifically if the Duchess was at home, Your Grace. The jealousy surged, hot and immediate. Alexander's jaw tightened. "Then inform the Duchess. She may receive him if she wishes. I have no interest in entertaining visitors today." Mrs. Hensworth studied him for a moment with those perceptive eyes that had known him since childhood. "As you wish, Your Grace." After she left, Alexander stood frozen in his study, listening to the sounds of the house. Footsteps in the corridor, the distant closing of a door, voices too low to distinguish. He imagined Catherine greeting Blackwood in the drawing room, imagined them sitting together in the sunlight that streamed through those south-facing windows, imagined her smiling at the man the way she had smiled at the ball. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. This was madness. He had no right to feel this way, no grounds for objection. He had built this situation stone by stone, pushing Catherine away with such consistency that her seeking companionship elsewhere was not only predictable, but entirely justified. If he walked down to that drawing room now and demanded Blackwood leave, on what grounds would he do so? Husbandly prerogative? He had abdicated that right through 7 years of neglect. Alexander forced himself to sit back down at his desk. He would not go to the drawing room. He would not interfere. He would master this irrational emotion the same way he mastered everything else in his life, through will and control and the application of reason over feeling. He lasted 20 minutes. Then he found himself standing, walking out of his study, down the corridor past startled servants, toward the drawing room where he could hear Catherine's voice mingling with a man's lower tones. He stopped outside the door, his hand on the handle, his heart pounding in a way that embarrassed him. What was he doing? What could he possibly say? Before he could decide, the door opened from the inside, and he found himself face to face with Catherine. She started, clearly surprised to see him standing there. Behind her, Viscount Blackwood rose politely from his seat. "Alexander," Catherine said, and there was something in her voice he couldn't identify. "I didn't know you were free. Lord Blackwood has called. He was just showing me a book of poetry he thought I might enjoy." Alexander looked past her at Blackwood, who met his gaze steadily, without challenge, but without deference either. The Viscount was handsome, Alexander noted with grim objectivity, not in the classical way of aristocratic breeding, but in the way of a man who had lived and suffered and retained kindness, the kind of man women like Catherine would find attractive, the kind of man who would know how to talk to a woman, to make her laugh, to see her as something more than an obligation. "Your Grace," Blackwood said, bowing slightly, "I hope I'm not intruding. I had business nearby and thought I'd pay my respects while in the area." "Not at all," Alexander heard himself say, his voice coming out colder than he intended. "Any friend of my wife's is welcome at Thornhill Manor." Something flickered in Catherine's eyes, surprise perhaps or suspicion. She knew him well enough, it seemed, to recognize that his words were not entirely sincere. "Actually," Alexander continued, surprising even himself, "I was just about to take a walk on the estate. Lord Blackwood, perhaps you'd care to join me. I'd be interested to hear about your agricultural innovations. I understand you've been experimenting with crop rotation." Blackwood glanced at Catherine, who looked as startled as the Viscount. "I wouldn't want to intrude on your afternoon." "You're not intruding," Alexander said firmly. "Catherine, you'll excuse us?" It was not a question. Catherine's face tightened almost imperceptibly, but she nodded with perfect grace. "Of course. I'll ask Mrs. Hensworth to prepare tea for when you return." Alexander led Blackwood out through the terrace doors and onto the west lawn. They walked in silence for a few moments, Alexander's mind racing to understand his own actions. Why had he done this? What did he hope to accomplish by separating Blackwood from Catherine? "Your estate is magnificent," Blackwood said finally. The Duchess spoke of it with great affection. "Did she?" Alexander's voice was tight. "She's very proud of the work she's done here. The school particularly. She described the curriculum in detail. It's quite progressive." "I'm sure it is." Alexander had no idea what curriculum Catherine had implemented. He'd never asked. They reached a small rise that offered a view of the house and the conservatory beyond. Blackwood paused, studying the landscape with genuine appreciation. It must be deeply satisfying to have built such a life together. The words struck Alexander like a blow. Built a life together. Is that what it looked like from the outside? He wanted to laugh at the bitter irony. Instead, he said carefully, "Lord Blackwood, I'll be direct. What are your intentions toward my wife?" Blackwood turned to face him fully, his expression serious. "My intentions are to be her friend, Your Grace. Nothing more." "Friends," Alexander repeated. "Yes. The Duchess is a remarkable woman who deserves kindness and intelligent conversation. If I can provide those things, with full respect for her marriage and your position, then I consider that a worthy use of my time." "She's my wife," Alexander said, hating the possessive edge in his voice. "She is," Blackwood agreed quietly. "But friendship isn't infidelity, unless you believe she shouldn't have friends at all." The challenge was gentle but unmistakable. Alexander found himself looking at this man, this widower, who had loved and lost and somehow retained his capacity for connection, with something approaching envy. What was she like? He heard himself ask. Your wife? Blackwood's expression softened. She was the great joy of my life. We had 7 years together before the consumption took her. 7 years of genuine partnership, of shared dreams and daily kindnesses. When she died, I thought I died with her. But, he paused, choosing words carefully. I've learned that love doesn't diminish for being shared. The love I gave Emma doesn't prevent me from caring about others, from building new friendships, from continuing to live in ways that honor what we had. 7 years, the same length as Alexander's marriage. But where Blackwood spoke of partnership and joy, Alexander could only catalogue distance and waste. You loved her very much, Alexander said. I did, and I love her still. But I'm learning that the heart has greater capacity than I knew. There's room for grief and room for new connection. They don't cancel each other out. They stood in silence, the summer breeze moving through the grass around them. Alexander thought of Emma, the ghost he'd been faithful to for 7 years at the cost of everything else. He thought of Catherine, alone in the conservatory, painting emotions she could never speak aloud. He thought of how thoroughly he had wasted the life he'd been given. The Duchess is fortunate to have found a friend, Alexander said finally, the admission costing him more than he expected. Blackwood studied him with those kind, perceptive eyes. Friendship is indeed valuable, Your Grace, but it's a poor substitute for what a marriage should be. I hope you'll forgive me for saying so. Alexander had no response to that. They walked back to the house in silence. Catherine stood at her easel in the conservatory, unable to focus on the canvas before her. 3 weeks had passed since William's first visit to Thornhill Manor. He had called twice more since then, always respectful, always proper, bringing books and conversation, and an ease of manner that made the hours pass like minutes. They talked about everything, literature, politics, philosophy, the small details of daily life that suddenly seemed worth discussing when someone actually listened. Catherine found herself looking forward to his visits with an intensity that frightened her. But more unsettling than William's visits were Alexander's changes, subtle at first, appearing at dinner and actually speaking to her, asking questions about the estate management, the school, her charitable work. Then more direct, requesting her company for afternoon walks, sitting beside her in the drawing room after dinner instead of disappearing to his study, even commenting once on one of her paintings when he happened past the conservatory door. Catherine didn't trust it. 7 years of indifference couldn't be undone by 3 weeks of suddenly attentive behavior. She responded to his overtures with polite caution, unwilling to hope, unable to forget. Every conversation felt like walking on glass. One wrong step, and the fragile new surface would shatter, revealing the same cold distance underneath. This afternoon, Alexander had actually asked if he might see her paintings. The request had stunned her into silence. Finally she'd said, "If you wish," and now she waited, paintbrush in hand, as his footsteps approached across the flagstones. He entered the conservatory with visible hesitation, as if unsure of his welcome. His gaze swept the space, the canvases stacked against walls, the works in progress, the paint-stained tables and scattered brushes. Catherine watched him take it all in, watched him stop before a particular painting, an abstract composition in blues and greys that she'd titled, in her private thoughts, Solitude. "You're very talented," he said quietly. "Thank you." Catherine kept her voice neutral. He moved to the next painting, this one a landscape of Thornhill Manor at dawn. "This is the one you gave me for our anniversary." "Yes. I should have looked at it more carefully. I should have—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "Catherine, I haven't been fair to you." Her hands tightened on the paintbrush. "Fairness was never part of our arrangement." "No, but—" He turned to face her fully. "I saw you, at the ball, with Blackwood. I saw you laughing, and I realized I'd never seen you that way before. I realized that in 7 years I've never given you any reason to laugh like that." Catherine set down her brush carefully, her heart pounding. "Why does it matter now?" "I don't know." he admitted. "I've been asking myself that same question. For 7 years, I've been—" He paused, then continued. "I was engaged before our marriage. Emma Thornbury. She died of a fever." "I know," Catherine said quietly. "Mrs. Hensworth told me years ago." Alexander looked startled. "You knew?" "Yes. It explained a great deal." He moved to the window, his back to her. "I thought if I kept myself apart, if I didn't allow myself to feel anything, I could protect myself from that pain again. I thought I was being strong. Instead, I've been a coward and cruel, and I've wasted 7 years of your life on my inability to move past my grief." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes, but refused to let them fall. "Is this about me, Alexander, or is this about the fact that another man paid me attention and you suddenly remembered I exist?" He flinched as if she'd struck him. "That's fair." "Nothing about this is fair." The words burst out before she could stop them. 7 years of suppressed emotion finally finding voice. "You can't ignore me for 7 years and then decide, because some other man showed me basic kindness, that you'll suddenly play at being a husband. I've built a life here that doesn't depend on you. I've learned to survive without your affection, your attention, your respect. You can't just decide one day that you want those things back because you're jealous." "I know," he said, his voice rough. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you. I know I've forfeited any claim to anything. But Catherine, is it truly too late? Is there no possibility that we might start again, build something that should have existed from the beginning?" She wanted to say yes, wanted to protect herself from the risk of hoping again. But looking at him standing there, for the first time showing her something real and vulnerable, she found she couldn't give him a simple answer. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't know if I can trust this. I don't know if you're truly changed, or if this is just a temporary reaction to feeling possessive. I don't know if I have the strength to open myself to you again, only to have you retreat the moment your jealousy fades." "I understand," Alexander said. "But could you consider allowing me to try? To prove that this isn't temporary, that I genuinely want to know you, to build the partnership we should have had?" Before Catherine could answer, Mrs. Hensworth appeared at the conservatory door. "Forgive the interruption, Your Grace, but Viscount Blackwood has called again. He wishes to know if you're at home." Catherine looked at Alexander, saw his jaw tighten, saw him fight for control. Then, to her surprise, he said, "Please show Lord Blackwood in, Mrs. Hensworth, to the conservatory." When William entered moments later, the tension in the space was palpable. He looked between Catherine and Alexander, his expression uncertain. "I seem to have arrived at an inopportune moment. I can return another time." "No," Alexander said. "Actually, I'm glad you're here. Catherine, would you excuse us for a moment? I'd like to speak with Lord Blackwood privately." Catherine looked at her husband in shock. "Alexander, please," he said, and there was something in his eyes, a request, not a command, that made her nod slowly and leave the conservatory, though her heart was racing with fear about what might be said in her absence. Inside the glass-walled room, Alexander faced William Blackwood and forced himself to be honest in a way he'd avoided for 7 years. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer truthfully." "Of course," William said carefully. "Are you in love with my wife?" William didn't flinch from the question. "I care for her deeply. She's become a dear friend. But no, I'm not in love with her. I'm still mourning Emma, still finding my way back to life. Catherine, the Duchess, has helped me remember what it feels like to have genuine human connection. But my feelings for her are those of friendship, nothing more. Even if she were free," Alexander pressed. William considered this carefully. "If circumstances were different, might I have come to love her? Perhaps. She's everything admirable, intelligent, kind, principled, but she's not free, Your Grace, and I'm not seeking to replace the woman I lost. I'm simply trying to be a good friend to someone who needed one." Alexander absorbed this, feeling something in his chest loosen slightly. She did need a friend. She needed many things I failed to provide. "It's not too late," William said gently. if you truly care for her. I don't know if I do, Alexander admitted. I don't know if I'm capable of it, but I want to try. And I need to know, will your friendship with her continue? Do you forbid it? No, Alexander said, surprising himself. I have no right to forbid her friendships, but I need to know if you can. He struggled to find the words. If I fail at this, if I can't become the husband she deserves, will you be there for her? William looked at him with something like respect. That's an extraordinary question, Your Grace. Will you? Yes, William said quietly. If she needs a friend, I'll be one. But I hope very much that she won't need that from me. I hope you'll succeed at what you're trying to do. They stood in silence for a moment, two men who should have been rivals, reaching an unexpected understanding. Then Alexander extended his hand. Thank you for being honest. William shook it firmly. Thank you for letting her have a friend. When Catherine returned to the conservatory 10 minutes later, William was taking his leave, and Alexander stood by the window, looking oddly peaceful. After William departed, she turned to her husband. What did you say to him? I asked him if he was in love with you, Alexander said bluntly. He said no, but that he valued your friendship. And I told him I had no right to forbid that friendship, but that I hoped to become someone who made it less necessary. Catherine stared at him, unable to process this confession. Why would you tell him that? Because I'm tired of lies, Alexander said simply. Tired of pretending I don't care. Tired of living half a life because I'm afraid of pain. 7 years ago I lost someone I loved, and I thought the answer was never to love again. But all I've done is waste 7 years causing pain to someone who deserved none of it. I don't understand, Catherine whispered. What are you saying? I'm saying I want to try. I'm saying that I don't know if I can be the husband you deserve, but I'd like the chance to discover if it's possible. I'm saying that seeing you with someone else made me realize what a fool I've been. He crossed the conservatory to stand before her, close enough that she could see the genuine emotion in his eyes. Catherine, I can't undo the past. I can't give you back the 7 years I wasted. But if you'll allow it, I'd like to try to build something real between us. It might take time, it might be painful, but I hope, it might be worth it. Catherine felt tears spill over, unable to stop them. You hurt me, she said, her voice breaking. For 7 years you made me feel invisible, worthless, like I was nothing more than furniture in your house. And now you want me to risk feeling that way again? No, he said firmly. I want you to risk feeling valued, seen, respected. I want to learn who you are, not who I've assumed you to be. I want to earn your trust, even though I know I've destroyed any right to it. And if you say no, if you tell me it's too late, I'll accept that. But please, Catherine, give me a chance to try. She looked at him through her tears, saw something in his face she'd never seen before, hope mingled with fear, vulnerability without the armor of aristocratic control. It was the first time in 7 years he'd shown her anything real. I don't know if I can trust this, she said finally, but I'm willing to see if you mean it. Don't make promises you can't keep, Alexander. Don't start something you'll abandon when it becomes difficult, because I won't survive being abandoned again. I understand, he said, and I promise you this, I will try. Every day I will try. It wasn't enough, not yet. Words were easy, and actions would take time to prove themselves, but it was, Catherine thought, a beginning, and perhaps beginnings were all anyone could ever truly promise. The summer unfolded slowly, each day a cautious step toward something neither Catherine nor Alexander fully trusted yet. Alexander began joining her for breakfast, and they discovered the strange art of morning conversation, tentative at first, then gradually easier. He asked about her paintings, and she found herself explaining her process, the way color could express what words couldn't. She asked about his parliamentary work, and he described the legislation he was drafting with an enthusiasm she'd never seen in him before. He came to the village school one afternoon and watched her teach, standing at the back of the classroom, while she led 15 children through their mathematics lessons. Afterward, walking back to the manor, he said quietly, "You're extraordinary with them. They adore you. They need someone to believe in them, Catherine replied. Most of them come from tenant families. No one's ever told them they could learn, could be more than their circumstances dictate. You give them that, he said. Hope. She glanced at him, surprised by the emotion in his voice. Someone gave that to me once, she said. My governess, Miss Hartley. She told me I had a mind worth cultivating. It changed everything for me. I never knew that, Alexander said. You never asked. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact, but he absorbed it like a blow. I want to know everything, he said, if you'll tell me. They began taking evening walks together, circling the estate as the summer sun stretched long shadows across the lawns. Catherine told him about her childhood, the loneliness of being an only child in a household that valued sons, the books she'd hidden under her bed to read by candlelight, the dreams she'd harbored before marriage taught her to put dreams away. Alexander listened with an attention that seemed to cost him effort, as if he were learning a new language. He told her haltingly about Emma, not the perfect memory he'd clung to, but the real woman, funny and argumentative and passionate about social reform, who had challenged him and made him think and occasionally made him furious. I made her into a saint after she died, he admitted, but she wasn't one. She was human, flawed, wonderful, and I dishonored her memory by using her as an excuse to stop living. Do you still love her? Catherine asked. I'll always love her, he said honestly. But I'm learning that loving someone who's gone doesn't mean I can't love someone who's here. The heart isn't so limited, I think. It just takes courage to open it again. These conversations were not easy. Often they stumbled into painful territory, memories of hurt, admissions of failure, the slow excavation of 7 years of accumulated wounds. Catherine found herself angry sometimes, unable to simply forgive and move forward, needing to speak the pain she'd carried silently for so long. Alexander listened, didn't defend himself, absorbed her anger without retaliating. It was, Catherine gradually realized, the first time anyone had allowed her to be angry without punishing her for it. The physical distance between them remained. Alexander had moved back to his own chambers in the West Wing, and they maintained separate sleeping arrangements. He never pushed for more, never presumed that emotional progress granted him physical access. Once passing each other in the corridor late at night, they'd stopped and stood awkwardly, each uncertain whether to speak or simply move on. Alexander had said finally, "Good night, Catherine. Sleep well," and she'd felt absurdly grateful for his restraint. William continued to visit, though less frequently now. His friendship remained important to Catherine, a reminder that she could be valued simply for herself, not for what she could provide. Alexander accepted these visits with visible effort but genuine grace, even joining their conversation sometimes, the three of them achieving an unexpected harmony. Once, watching William and Alexander discuss agricultural reforms while she painted, Catherine felt a surge of something like contentment. These two good men, both trying in their own ways to respect and support her. It was more than she dared hope for months ago. In August, on the anniversary of their wedding 7 years prior, Alexander appeared at breakfast with a small wrapped parcel. Catherine opened it to find a leather journal, expensive and beautifully made, with her initials embossed on the cover. I thought you might like it for, I don't know, sketches or thoughts or whatever you wish, he said, suddenly uncertain. If it's not appropriate. It's perfect, Catherine interrupted, running her fingers over the leather. Thank you. That evening, he asked if she would dine with him in the small family dining room rather than the formal one. She agreed, and they ate by candlelight at a table for two, talking about everything and nothing. Books they'd read, childhood memories, the garden's late summer blooms. When the meal ended, Alexander stood and extended his hand. Would you walk with me? He asked. There's something I want to show you. She took his hand, the first time she'd voluntarily touched him in 7 years, and let him lead her through the house and out onto the grounds. They walked in the gathering dusk, past the conservatory and the formal gardens, to a part of the estate she rarely visited. A small walled garden that had been allowed to grow wild. I had the gardeners restore this, Alexander said, opening the iron gate. It was my mother's favorite place when I was a child. She planted roses and made me memorize their names. After she died, my father let it go to ruin. He couldn't bear to see it without her. Catherine stepped inside and caught her breath. The space had been transformed. Roses climbed the old stone walls, their blooms luminous in the fading light. A small fountain had been repaired and gurgled softly in the center. Pathways of old brick wound between beds of lavender and sage. It was intimate, secret, beautiful. I thought perhaps you might like to paint here, Alexander said quietly, or simply sit. It's yours, if you want it, a place that's entirely your own. Catherine turned to him, tears in her eyes. Why did you do this? Because I'm trying to understand how to show you that you matter, he said simply. Because you deserve beautiful things and space that's yours. Because, he paused, then continued with careful honesty. Because I'm hoping that if I give you enough reasons to stay, you might choose to build a life with me, rather than simply endure one. She looked at him standing there in the twilight, this man who had hurt her so deeply and was now trying, with clumsy sincerity, to heal what he'd broken. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was something. It was effort. It was hope. Thank you, she whispered. He stepped closer, lifted one hand slowly, giving her time to move away. When she didn't, he touched her face gently, his thumb brushing away a tear. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, he said. I know 7 years can't be undone with gestures and gardens, but I want you to know that every day I'm trying to become someone worthy of you. Catherine closed her eyes, leaning into his touch despite her fear. I'm trying too, she admitted, trying to trust this, trying to believe it's real. It's real, he promised. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. They stood like that for a long moment, the first real tenderness between them in 7 years, both of them trembling with the fragility of new things. Then Alexander lowered his hand and stepped back, giving her space. They walked back to the house in companionable silence, and when they parted at the top of the stairs, he to his wing, she to hers, Catherine found herself smiling. It was a beginning, just that. But perhaps, she thought, sometimes beginnings were enough. Autumn came to Thornhill Manor in shades of gold and crimson. Catherine spent her mornings in the restored garden, painting the changing leaves, while Alexander worked in his study with the door open. The sound of her movements, a presence he'd learned to find comforting rather than intrusive. They had settled into a rhythm that felt almost like partnership. Breakfast together, separate pursuits during the day, walks in the evening, dinner in the small dining room where conversation came more easily now. But the physical distance remained, and Catherine felt its weight growing heavier as emotional intimacy increased. She wanted to trust Alexander's transformation, wanted to believe that this new version of their marriage was sustainable. But the memory of those 7 years, of being touched without tenderness, needed without being wanted, created a wall she didn't know how to dismantle. Alexander, for his part, seemed content to wait. He never pressed, never made demands, never even hinted that he expected more than she was ready to give. His patience was genuine, but Catherine sometimes caught him looking at her with an expression of such longing that it took her breath away. He wanted her, she realized, not as a duty or an obligation, but as a woman, a person, someone he genuinely desired. The knowledge was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. In October, the village held a harvest festival, and Catherine convinced Alexander to attend with her. They walked through the fair together, tasting cider and honey cakes, watching children play games, accepting the delighted greetings of tenants who had rarely seen their duke at such events. Alexander was awkward at first, uncertain how to interact with people outside his usual aristocratic circles. But Catherine watched him try, asking about crops, remembering names, even laughing at a jest made by the blacksmith. As evening fell and musicians began to play, couples started dancing on the village green. Alexander turned to Catherine and extended his hand. "Will you dance with me?" She hesitated, remembering the last time she'd danced, with William at the midsummer ball, the moment that had begun this entire transformation. "Here, in front of everyone?" "Especially here," he said. "I want everyone to see that I'm proud to be your husband." She took his hand, and he led her into the circle of dancers. It was a simple country dance, nothing like the formal waltzes of London ballrooms, but as they moved through the steps, Catherine felt something shift inside her chest. Alexander was looking at her, truly seeing her, and smiling with genuine joy. Around them, villagers watched and whispered, clearly surprised to see their austere duke dancing with such evident pleasure. When the dance ended, Alexander didn't let go of her hand. Instead, he pulled her slightly closer and said, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "Thank you for reminding me how to live, Catherine. I'd forgotten." The walk back to the manor that night was filled with a charged silence neither of them knew how to break. When they reached the house and climbed the stairs to their separate chambers, they paused at the landing where their paths diverged. "Catherine," Alexander said, his voice low, "I don't want to rush you. I don't want to push for more than you're ready to give, but I need you to know—" He paused, gathering courage. "I need you to know that when I look at you now, I don't see an obligation or a duty. I see the woman I should have cherished from the beginning. I see someone I'm falling in love with, slowly and terribly, and I don't know what to do with all this feeling, except tell you the truth." Catherine's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break free of her chest. "Alexander, you don't have to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know, so that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, you'll understand that it's real, that I'm here not out of jealousy or possession, but because I genuinely want to build a life with you." He kissed her hand, a gesture both formal and tender, then released it and walked to his chambers. Catherine stood alone in the corridor, trembling, feeling the last of her carefully maintained distance beginning to crumble. She went to her room but couldn't sleep. She paced, sat at her window, tried to read. Finally, at midnight, she pulled a shawl around her shoulders and walked through the quiet house to Alexander's door. She stood there for a long moment, her hand raised to knock, fear and desire warring in her chest. Before she could decide, the door opened. Alexander stood there in his shirt sleeves, his hair disheveled, looking as sleepless as she felt. "Catherine, I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. "I don't know if I can risk my heart again." "I know," he said gently. "I'm terrified too." They stood there in the doorway, both afraid, both wanting. Then Catherine said very softly, "May I come in?" He stepped back immediately, giving her space to enter or leave, making no assumptions. Catherine walked into his chambers, a space she'd been in perhaps 20 times in 7 years, always briefly, always with dread. But tonight it looked different, lived in, human. Books stacked on tables, papers scattered on a desk, a fire burning low in the grate. "I'm not ready for—" she began. "I know," Alexander interrupted. "That's not why. I don't expect—" He took a breath, started over. "What do you need, Catherine?" She looked at him, this man who had hurt her and was now trying so hard to heal what he'd broken, and found herself answering with absolute honesty. "I need to know this is real. I need to know that tomorrow you won't wake up and decide this was all a mistake, that the distance was easier, that you prefer being alone." "I won't," he said. "I promise you, I won't." "How can I believe that?" "I don't know," he admitted, "except that I'm asking you to judge me by what I do every single day from now on, not by what I failed to do for 7 years. I'm asking you to give me the chance to prove it over time." Catherine walked to the fire and stood warming her hands, trying to organize her chaotic thoughts. "When you touch me," she said quietly, not looking at him, When you used to come to my room, I felt like an object, something to be used and set aside. It broke something in me, Alexander. Made me feel worthless in a way I'm not sure I can heal from." Behind her, she heard him draw a sharp breath. "God, Catherine, I'm so sorry." "Sorry isn't enough," she said, turning to face him. "I need to know that if we—" that if this becomes more than companionship, it won't be like that. I need to know that you'll see me, want me, value me as a person, not just perform a duty." "It wouldn't be," he said intensely, crossing to stand before her but not touching. "Catherine, if you let me, I would spend hours learning what pleases you, what makes you feel cherished. I would make it beautiful if you'd give me the chance, but only when you're ready, only when you truly want it." She looked up at him, saw the truth in his eyes, the desire tempered by patience and respect. "I'm not ready tonight," she said, "I know, but I think I'm starting to want to be." He smiled, soft and genuine. "Then we have all the time in the world." She reached up and touched his face, the first time she'd initiated such contact. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "So am I," he admitted. "But I think courage means being afraid and trying anyway." They stood like that for a long moment. Then Catherine rose on her toes and kissed him gently. It was chaste, tentative, nothing like the perfunctory kisses of their wedding or the mechanical encounters that had followed. It was a beginning, a question, a small act of tremendous bravery. When she pulled back, Alexander was looking at her with such wonder that she felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. Catherine returned to her chambers with her heart full of fear and hope in equal measure. She didn't know if this would work, if trust could be rebuilt, if love could grow in soil that had been barren for so long, but she was beginning to believe it might be possible. Winter came gently to Thornhill Manor, settling over the estate like a soft blanket. Catherine and Alexander moved through the short days with a growing ease, their relationship deepening in ways both subtle and profound. They began spending evenings together in the library, reading aloud to each other, discussing books and ideas until the fire burned low and the clock struck midnight. Alexander showed her his poetry collection, confessing that he'd always loved verse but had never told anyone. Catherine shared her journals, filled with thoughts and sketches and the private observations she'd never expected anyone to see. They learned each other slowly. Alexander discovered that Catherine sang while she painted, soft melodies she probably didn't realize she was making. Catherine learned that Alexander had nightmares sometimes, that grief had left scars on him he still carried. They began the careful work of building intimacy, not through grand gestures, but through small, daily acts of attention and care. In December, Catherine's father passed away suddenly. She received the news by courier and stood in the entrance hall holding the letter, too numb to cry. Alexander found her there an hour later, still frozen, the letter crumpled in her hand. He didn't ask questions, simply wrapped her in his arms and held her while she finally broke down. 7 years of unshed tears pouring out in great, shaking sobs. He travelled with her to London for the funeral, stayed by her side through all the grim ceremonies and family obligations. He held her hand during the service, and when her mother made subtle criticisms about Catherine's childlessness, he interrupted firmly, "Catherine has built a remarkable life at Thornhill Manor. She's accomplished more in 7 years than most people do in a lifetime. I'm immensely proud of her." It was the first time he had publicly defended her, claimed her not as property, but as a partner. Catherine felt something in her chest that had been frozen for years begin, finally, to thaw. Back at Thornhill Manor, Catherine found herself gravitating toward Alexander's presence. She would seek him out during the day, sharing observations or asking opinions, simply wanting to be near him. He responded with obvious pleasure, making space for her in his study, his library, his life. They fell into new patterns, walking together before breakfast, discussing estate business over afternoon tea, sitting side by side in the drawing room in companionable silence while he worked on correspondence and she sketched. Christmas approached, and Catherine threw herself into preparations with an enthusiasm she hadn't felt in years. She decorated the manor, organized gifts for the servants and tenant families, planned a holiday gathering. Alexander watched her work with undisguised admiration. "You're like a force of nature," he said one afternoon, watching her direct footman in hanging garlands. "Beautiful and unstoppable." She laughed, surprising herself with the sound. "I'm making up for lost time. 7 years of joyless Christmases. I intend to correct that." On Christmas Eve, after the servants had retired and the house had fallen quiet, Alexander led Catherine to the library where a fire burned bright and 2 glasses of wine waited. "I have something for you," he said. He presented her with a large, flat package wrapped in brown paper. Catherine opened it and caught her breath. It was the painting she'd done of Thornhill Manor at sunset, the one she'd given him on their 3rd anniversary, the one he'd barely glanced at before hanging in the morning room. But it had been transformed. He'd had it professionally cleaned and restored, then set in an exquisite gilded frame, and he'd added something. A small brass plaque at the bottom engraved with words. Catherine leaned close to read, "Thornhill Manor, as seen through the eyes of love, painted by Catherine, Duchess of Thornhill." "I hung it in my study," Alexander said quietly, "above my desk, so I see it every day, so I remember what I almost lost through my own blindness." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "Alexander, I have one more thing," he interrupted, pulling a smaller package from his pocket. Inside was a key, old and ornate. "This is the key to my chambers. I'm giving it to you not as an obligation or an expectation, but as a symbol. My door is always open to you. My space is your space, and if you never use it, if you're never ready to come to me, that's your right and I'll respect it. But I want you to have it. I want you to know that you're welcome in every part of my life." She took the key with shaking hands. They sat together by the fire, not speaking, simply being present with the weight of what had been offered and accepted. And when Catherine finally rose to retire to her chambers, she slipped the key into her pocket and carried it with her like a promise. In January, William Blackwood announced his engagement. He brought his fiancée to Thornhill Manor to introduce her, a gentle widow named Sarah with kind eyes and a warm smile. Catherine embraced them both with genuine joy, grateful that William had found happiness again. The 4 of them spent an afternoon together, and Catherine watched Alexander converse easily with William, the tension that had once existed between them replaced by mutual respect. After William and Sarah departed, Catherine and Alexander walked together through the winter garden. "I'm glad he found someone," Catherine said. "As am I," Alexander agreed. "He deserves it, and you—" He paused, then continued carefully. "You could have chosen him, you know. He would have been kind to you, gentle. Everything I wasn't." "Perhaps," Catherine acknowledged, "but that's not what happened. What happened is that his kindness reminded me I deserved more than I'd settled for, and his friendship gave me the courage to demand it from you. I'll always be grateful to him for that," Alexander said, "for being there when I wasn't, for reminding you of your worth." They walked in silence for a moment. Then Catherine said quietly, "I think I'm ready." "Ready for what?" She stopped walking and turned to face him, the key he'd given her at Christmas, warming in her pocket. "Ready to trust this. Ready to believe that what we're building is real and sustainable. Ready to—" She took a breath. "Ready to try being your wife in every way, not just in name." Alexander went very still. "Catherine, you don't have to—" "I know I don't have to," she interrupted, "but I want to. I want to know what it feels like to be touched by someone who actually sees me, values me, wants me. I want to replace those old memories with new ones. I want—" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I want to know what love feels like." He closed the distance between them, cupped her face in his hands with infinite gentleness. "Are you certain?" "I'm terrified," she admitted. "But yes, I'm certain." "Then tonight," he said. "If you still feel the same tonight, come to me." "But Catherine—" He made her look at him. "If you change your mind, if you're not ready, if you need more time, I will understand. There's no pressure, no expectation. I'll wait as long as you need." That evening, Catherine took more care with her preparations than she had on her wedding night. She bathed, braided her hair loosely, wore a nightgown of soft white lawn. She stood at her window for a long time, watching stars appear in the winter sky, gathering her courage. Then she took the key from her dressing table and walked through the quiet house to Alexander's door. She used the key, the sound of the lock turning seemed impossibly loud, and entered. Alexander sat by the fire reading, still fully dressed, clearly unwilling to presume. When he saw her, he set the book aside and stood. "Catherine." She walked to him slowly, her heart pounding. "I'm here." "You're sure?" "I'm sure." What followed was nothing like those awful mechanical encounters of the past 7 years. Alexander moved with exquisite slowness, asking permission for every touch, every kiss, making certain she was present and willing at every moment. He was gentle, but not tentative, passionate but controlled, focused entirely on her experience, her pleasure, her comfort. He whispered her name like a prayer, and looked at her with such reverence that Catherine felt beautiful for the first time in her life. Afterward, lying in his arms while firelight flickered across the ceiling, Catherine wept, not from pain or regret, but from relief. "That's what it was supposed to be," she whispered. "All those years, that's what it could have been." "I'm so sorry," Alexander said, his voice rough. "I'm so sorry I stole that from you." "You can't change the past," Catherine said, turning to look at him, "but you can honor the present. And you did. Alexander, you made me feel—" She searched for words. "You made me feel cherished." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "You are cherished, every part of you. I love you, Catherine. I should have said it sooner, but I love you." She smiled through her tears. "I'm beginning to love you too. Not the idea of you, not the hope of you, but the actual person you're becoming. It's terrifying. For me too," he admitted, "but also exhilarating." They fell asleep, tangled together, and when Catherine woke at dawn in Alexander's bed, her first thought was not panic, but peace. She studied his sleeping face, the vulnerability visible only in unguarded moments, and felt the last of her defenses crumble. She had been right to be afraid. Love was a risk, and trusting someone who had hurt her was an act of profound courage. But looking at him now, she thought perhaps some risks were worth taking. Spring returned to Thornhill Manor with a flourish of green and gold. Catherine and Alexander had settled into their new normal, a marriage that finally resembled partnership, companionship, love. They still had difficult moments, days when old hurts resurfaced and conversations turned painful, but they had learned to face those moments together rather than retreating into separate corners. Catherine moved her belongings into Alexander's chambers, their chambers now, and they woke together each morning, often talking for an hour before rising. They made love with increasing freedom and joy, learning each other's bodies, building a physical intimacy that matched their emotional connection. Catherine discovered that passion could be tender, that desire could be mutual, that she could be powerful in her own pleasure. They traveled to London for the spring season, and this time their public appearances felt different. Alexander stayed by her side at balls and dinners, danced with her multiple times, made clear to everyone that his wife was not just an ornament, but his partner. Society noticed the change. Whispers followed them about how devoted the Duke had become, how radiant the Duchess looked. At one ball, Catherine found herself standing with a group of young wives who were discussing their marriages in hushed tones. One complained about her husband's infidelities, another about being ignored. Catherine listened and felt profound gratitude for how far she and Alexander had come. "But surely you understand, Duchess," one woman said. "These arranged marriages, they're rarely love matches. We must simply endure." Catherine thought about her first 7 years, about the endurance she'd practiced, the way she'd convinced herself that survival was enough. Then she thought about the past 6 months, about choosing to risk her heart, about the joy she'd found in that risk. "I think," she said carefully, "that we deserve more than endurance, and sometimes, if we're brave enough to demand it, we might actually get it." The women looked at her with a mixture of confusion and curiosity, but Catherine didn't elaborate. Some truths had to be lived to be understood. In May, on the anniversary of that transformative midsummer ball a year ago, Alexander surprised Catherine by hosting their own ball at Thornhill Manor. He invited everyone who mattered: society, neighbours, tenant families, the village. The ballroom that had stood unused for years blazed with light. Catherine wore a gown of deepest blue, And when Alexander saw her descending the stairs, he looked at her with such open love that she blushed. "You're stunning," he said. "You're not so bad yourself," she teased, adjusting his cravat. They opened the ball together, waltzing before their guests with genuine joy evident in every step. But midway through the evening, Alexander stopped the orchestra and called for attention. "I have an announcement," he said, his voice carrying through the crowded ballroom. Catherine looked at him in confusion. They'd planned no announcements. "A year ago," he continued, "I attended a ball in London and saw my wife dance with another man. And in that moment, I realized what a complete fool I'd been for 7 years. I realized that I'd been given a gift, this remarkable woman, and I'd ignored her, neglected her, failed to see her value." Catherine's eyes widened. The ballroom had gone completely silent. "Tonight," Alexander said, taking her hand, "I want everyone here to know that Catherine is not just my duchess. She's my partner, my friend, my greatest source of happiness. She's transformed this estate, this community, and most importantly, she's transformed me. And I will spend the rest of my life grateful that she gave me a second chance I absolutely did not deserve." He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it, while the ballroom erupted in applause. Catherine felt tears streaming down her face. "That was entirely unnecessary," she whispered when the noise died down and the music resumed. "It was absolutely necessary," he countered. "I wasted 7 years being silent. I'm done with silence." They danced together until midnight, laughed with guests, played the role of gracious hosts. But Catherine's favorite moment came near the end of the evening, when they stood together on the terrace, watching guests depart through the manor's front gates. "Are you happy?" Alexander asked quietly. Catherine thought about the question seriously. Happy was a word she'd given up on for so many years, but standing here now, her hand in Alexander's, her future stretching before her full of promise instead of emptiness. Yes, she thought, against all odds, despite all the pain, she was happy. "I am," she said. "Are you?" "More than I ever thought possible," he replied. "More than I deserve." "We both deserve this," Catherine corrected. "We fought for it. We chose it. That makes it ours." He pulled her close, and they stood together in the warm spring night, two people who had found each other twice, once through obligation, once through choice. The second finding, Catherine thought, was infinitely more valuable than the first. Inside the ballroom, musicians packed their instruments. Servants cleared champagne glasses and extinguished candles. The evening was ending, but their life together was just beginning, truly beginning, for the first time. And that, Catherine thought, leaning into her husband's embrace, was worth every moment of pain it had taken to get here. 5 years after that spring ball, Catherine stood in the conservatory painting while late summer sun streamed through the glass. She was working on a portrait this time, not an abstract expression of emotion, but an actual person. Alexander, reading in the garden, unaware he was being observed. Her technique had improved dramatically. She'd even sold several pieces to galleries in London, though she painted primarily for joy now, rather than necessity. The conservatory remained her sanctuary, but it was no longer a refuge from loneliness. It was simply a space she loved. "Mama, Mama!" a small voice called from the doorway. Catherine set down her brush and turned to see her daughter, 4-year-old Emma Margaret, running toward her with grass-stained skirts and wild curls escaping her braids. Behind her, moving more carefully, was her younger brother, 3-year-old James, carrying a frog cupped in his pudgy hands. "Look what we found," Emma announced breathlessly. "Papa says it's a common frog, and we can keep it if we make a proper habitat, but James wants to bring it inside, and I said that's not proper at all." "No frogs in the house," Catherine confirmed, kneeling to examine the creature. "But we can make a lovely home for it in the garden. What shall you name it?" "Herbert," James declared. "Absolutely not. That's a terrible name," Emma protested. "We should call it something regal. Duke Ribbington." Catherine laughed, the sound coming easily now. "Why don't you discuss it with your father while I finish this painting? Then we'll all have tea in the garden." The children raced off, arguing amiably about amphibian nomenclature. Catherine returned to her easel, adding a few more strokes to capture the sunlight on Alexander's hair. She thought about those first 7 years sometimes, though less and less as time passed. The pain had faded, replaced by a deep appreciation for how far they'd traveled together. They'd had their children late, Emma born when Catherine was 32, James the following year, but perhaps that timing had been necessary. They'd needed those years to build a foundation strong enough to support a family. Alexander was a devoted father, patient and playful in ways he never could have been if he'd remained locked in grief. He read to the children every night, played endless games of hide-and-seek, taught Emma to ride and James to identify birds. And with Catherine, he remained the partner he'd promised to become, attentive, affectionate, present. They still had their challenges. Catherine's temper could flare when she felt dismissed, an old wound that occasionally reopened. Alexander sometimes withdrew into himself when stressed, reverting briefly to old patterns before catching himself. But they'd learned to recognize these moments, to speak honestly about them, to extend grace to each other's imperfections. Mrs. Hensworth appeared at the conservatory door, smiling at the scene. She'd served the family for 30 years and had witnessed every stage of this marriage. "Tea is ready when you are, Your Grace," she said. "Thank you, Mrs. Hensworth. I'll be there shortly." When the housekeeper left, Catherine added one final touch to the painting, a small figure beside Alexander in the garden, herself, seen from behind, walking toward him, reaching for him. The image captured something true about their marriage now, two people choosing daily to move toward each other rather than apart. She cleaned her brushes, removed her apron, and walked out into the garden where her family waited. Emma was building an elaborate palace for Duke Ribbington, using stones and moss. James had lost interest in the frog and was now examining a butterfly. Alexander looked up as Catherine approached, and his face transformed with the smile he reserved only for her. "Come see what your daughter has created," he said, making space for her on the blanket. "It's architecturally unsound, but admirably ambitious." Catherine settled beside him, her hand finding his naturally, their fingers laced together. A gesture so familiar now it required no thought. She watched her children play, felt the warmth of the sun and her husband's presence, and recognized this moment for what it was: joy, simple and complete. "I love you," she said quietly, not for the first time that day. "I love you," Alexander replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Every day more than the last." Emma looked up from her construction project. "Are you being mushy again? Papa, you promised to help with the moat." Alexander laughed and rose to assist with the frog palace. Catherine watched him kneel beside their daughter, listened to their serious discussion about drainage systems, and felt profound gratitude for the life they'd built together. She thought about that girl she'd been on her wedding day, 20 years old, full of hope and terror, believing she'd been given everything and having no idea how little she actually had. She thought about the woman she'd become in those first 7 years, resigned, lonely, convinced that survival was the best she could hope for. And then she thought about the moment that had changed everything. A single dance with a kind man who'd reminded her she deserved more, followed by the terrifying choice to demand it, not just from Alexander, but from herself. The choice to be brave enough to risk her heart again, to fight for something better than endurance. That choice had made all the difference. "Mama, come help," James called, and Catherine joined her family on the grass, her heart full of love and the hard-won knowledge that some stories, even those that begin badly, can end well. Not through magic or fate, but through the daily choice to try, to forgive, to build something beautiful from broken pieces. The afternoon stretched golden and warm, and Catherine Beaumont, Duchess of Thornhill, lived happily in it, not in spite of her past, but because of what she'd learned from it. That happiness wasn't given. It was chosen, built, fought for, and fiercely protected. And she would protect it for all the days she had left, with gratitude and grace, and the unshakable certainty that she and Alexander had earned it together. The end.